and welcome back! Today we're going to be looking at King Lear, which is one of my absolute favorite of Shakespeare's tragedies. In fact, I love this play so much that I named my daughter after one of the characters, the best daughter in all of literature, Cordelia. In my opinion, this play has some of the most heartbreaking and moving sections in all of Shakespeare. There are some fantastic grief scenes in this, plus some really gripping and moving themes. Because I love this play so much, there's no way I'm going to do it full justice in one video. So this video is going to be an introduction and general overview. Later on, when I'm finished with my overall Shakespeare project, I'm going to come back and do different videos over each act. This play definitely deserves a closer examination. For now, though, I'd like to talk about some of the overarching ideas and then give you a quick summary. This play is, in part, about love. It's about the love between family members and how much love you give to your children and how much love a child gives to a parent. It might be worth going back and looking at some of these other problematic parent-child relationships in Hamlet, for instance. But one of the most important points within King Lear is the distinction between love that's associated with physical property and love that's freely given. Within this play, there are several characters who can't distinguish between love and property. You show love by giving property. You connect people you love with how much you own them or give them. And characters who tend to think in those terms wind up breaking all of their relationships and ending up without anything. Powerfully, though, characters who learn to love without anything else, just loving truly the person, him or herself, ultimately find the riches of love. It's not the riches of physical wealth or property, it's the riches of real love. Again, making this one of the most powerful Shakespeare plays I've ever read. Along with this connection between love and property, there comes the idea of power. It's hard to talk about property and ownership without talking about power. And several characters exert their power over, obviously, property, but also over relationships. By saying, I have the most property, or I have the most control of property, and therefore I am the most powerful, and therefore you should love me. That's really Lear's problem at the beginning. Can one love when one is powerless? Can one love when one is penniless? There's also the idea of personal worth, which comes into play with a relationship. If I have no value, can anyone love me? This is one of the problems of Edmund, who's a really dastardly villain within this play. But his villainous nature seems to stem from his feelings of complete inadequacy. He feels that because he is illegitimate and has no property, he has to somehow get back at everyone in his life and take that property and that power by force. Then he'll be something, and then he'll be somebody. Contrast this with characters like Cordelia and Kent, who lose everything very quickly because they aren't willing to give up on their morals. And yet, ultimately, with nothing, they become incredibly influential and powerful and show the most true relationships with the characters around them. This play also contains a really fascinating character in the Fool, who is a counterpoint to King Lear. Lear makes some really bad decisions and shows himself to be a big, colossal jerk. And although he's the hero of this story, he has some serious faults at the beginning. The Fool becomes something of a voice of reason to King Lear, the only one that he'll actually listen to, although that voice of reason is in a topsy-turvy comic form. Ultimately, though, the Fool mysteriously vanishes halfway through the play. And there isn't really a clear explanation for that. Sometimes productions will kill off the Fool halfway through, or make him give up on Lear and wander away. What you do with him is interesting. Finally, I want to note that from a publication perspective, King Lear is one of the few plays that actually shows us Shakespeare's editing process. Most of the plays we get of Shakespeare's, we get in their final form, although we might have variations given the fact that different people published it and made mistakes or left parts out. Lear most clearly shows us two separate versions, an early version and a later version. If you want to understand a little bit more about Shakespeare's publication, I have a video over that. In short, one of the early publications was a quarto text. Not officially published by Shakespeare, but most scholars think that it actually used his foul papers, or his original draft. Later there was a version of the play published in the First Folio, which is usually considered one of the best sources for Shakespeare's texts. And it is distinguishably different from the first draft. 300 lines have been chopped out, and 100 new lines have been added in. It seems that Shakespeare changed the play over time. Why? We don't really know. Maybe he did it because of the reaction of his audience, or maybe he did it to adapt to certain current events or things going on in his day. But because it's one of the only instances we have of showing Shakespeare changing his work, it is particularly interesting to scholarship. So let's look at the plot of this play. There are also two key subplots to this, and both of them are about family. We have the story of King Lear, who divides up his property based upon how much his daughters say they love him, and then ultimately finds out that the ones who said they loved him the most, because they knew they were going to get property out of it, didn't really love him very much at all. And ultimately this leads him to being driven out and rescued by the third daughter, who didn't profess her love as much in words, but loved him truly in duty. The subplot is between Gloucester and his two sons, one the legitimate, Edgar, and the illegitimate son, Edmund. Edmund cooks up a plot to make it look like his brother Edgar is going to try to kill their father Gloucester. And Gloucester buys this, and Edgar has to go on the run, and ultimately Edmund gets praised, and he gets all the property, and he rises to power, and then, once he has control of the situation, he and some of the other villains try to get Gloucester out of the way. Ultimately, he pays for his crimes. Both plots show the relationship between a father and children, both loyal children and disloyal children, and the significance of those are examined throughout the play. So let's look at how this plot breaks down. The first scene opens with Gloucester talking to Kent. Kent is a follower of King Lear, and he's going to be one of the most loyal characters throughout this play. And Gloucester and Kent are talking both about the king's upcoming, basically, abdication. He's handing off all of his property and rule, and then he's just going to rest on his laurels, which is a little weird. Retaining the name of king, but not actually doing the job. And they also talk about Edmund, who is Gloucester's illegitimate son. And Gloucester is really insensitive as he talks about Edmund. He jokes around about Edmund's birth, and although Edmund is a handsome young man, he's basically kind of hidden him away at various boarding schools to keep him out of sight. Edmund feels this embarrassment. Edmund feels this sort of disdain. He's not propertied, and therefore, in some ways, not loved. But we cut to the main feature, which is King Lear, who's splitting up his kingdom among his three daughters. His daughters are Goneril, Regan, and Cordelia. And he says, "Whoever says she loves me the most gets the best of my property. How about you, Goneril?" And Goneril's like, "Yeah, I love you so much, Daddy Dads. You're the best dad in the whole world, and I just love you." And he's like, "Yeah, that's what I'm talking about. Have some property." And so Goneril and her husband, Albany, are given a third of the kingdom. And then he turns to Regan. And Regan says, "Oh, I love you so much as she said, and even more!" And the king's like, "Yeah, here's a third of my kingdom." And he gives it to Regan and her husband, Cornwall. And then he turns to Cordelia and he's like, "Cordelia, my favorite, my youngest, what about you? What can you say that's even better than your sisters?" And Cordelia's like, "I can't say anything better than my sisters. They're obviously lying. After all, if they love you more than life itself and there's nothing else in life that gives them pleasure, why did they ever go and get married anyway? If you're the only joy in their eyes, obviously I love you as much as the daughter should love her father, and that's it." King Lear is not happy with this answer. He feels like she is being cold towards him, and he's so angry that he disinherits her, even though she was his favorite 5 minutes ago. Kent tries to stand up and stop him and saying, "This is a really bad idea. She's really loyal, she's wonderful, she loves you." And King Lear's like, "No, you're banished too now." And so he's banished his most loyal follower, and he's disinherited his most loyal daughter. What a mess. Then Cordelia's two suitors come in, Burgundy and the King of France, and King Lear's like, "Here's my daughter. If you want her, you can take her, but I don't love her, and I'm not giving her any property." Burgundy points out that without property, he cannot love Cordelia. Notice the link between property and love. The King of France, though, recognizes that Cordelia is in herself a dowry, he says. Her goodness is a dowry, and she is valuable in her character and in her ability to love meaningfully, not just with words. And so he marries her, and she goes off to France. King Lear then arranges for himself to stay at his two daughters' houses, one at a time. So that's where the plot really sets everything going. We cut to Edmund, who is giving a speech on, hey, why do bastards get such a bad rap? I'm illegitimate, but I'm going to rise above this, and I'm going to crush everyone down who's in my way. Thou, nature, art my goddess. To thy law my services are bound. Wherefore should I stand in the plague of custom, and permit the curiosity of nations to deprive me? For that I am some 12 or 14 moonshines lag of a brother? Why bastard? Wherefore base? When my dimensions are as well compact, my mind is generous, and my shape is true, as honest madam's issue. Why brand they us with base, with baseness, bastardy, base, base? Who in the lusty stealth of nature take more composition and fierce quality than doth within a dull, stale, tired bed, go to the creating of whole tribe of fops got twixt asleep and wake. Well then, legitimate Edgar, I must have your land. Our father's love is to the bastard Edmund as to the legitimate. Fine word, legitimate. Well, my legitimate, if this letter speed and my invention thrive, Edmund, the base, shall top the legitimate. I grow, I prosper. Now, gods, stand up for bastards. And so he acts like he has this secret letter from Edgar, making Gloucester think that Edgar is planning to kill him. And then Edmund goes around to Edgar and is like, man, you must have really angered Dad. Why is he so mad at you? What did you do? And Edgar, of course, doesn't know what he did, but Edmund tells him that he needs to hide out for a little while, and Edmund will be the kind go-between to try to work things out. Cut to Albany's palace, where Goneril is dealing with her dad, and he's being really obnoxious. He made it a condition that he would get to keep 100 nights and stay at her house, but she's sick of it. And granted, he is being really pretentious and obnoxious, but she is a complete jerk to him. She advises her servants to treat him with disrespect. Then in comes Kent, who, of course, he was banished, but now he's put on a disguise so he can continue to be loyal to Lear, even though he's been banished. It's funny that Lear is worst to the people who love him most. And so Kent basically goes through an interview process with the king to become one of his servants again. And when Goneril's servants treat the king with disrespect, particularly the jerk Oswald, Kent stands up for him. Lear calls in his fool, who then tells him what's really happening. He points out that the king has been a fool to have given up his crown and his power and his authority for people who didn't love him. In comes Goneril, who tells him that she's sick and tired of him and all of his knights, and he needs to cut their number in half if he wants to stay. He's so angry that he curses her and storms out and decides to go live with Regan, because Regan really loves him. Albany comes in and he's sort of surprised by all of this. He doesn't realize what's going on in his own house. But Lear's already had it, and Lear's out the door. Goneril goes and sends Oswald over to her sister Regan to go to kind of let her know what's up, so that she won't treat Lear any better. Lear sends the disguised Kent/Caius ahead of him to go tell Regan that they're coming. And so we come to Act 2. In Act 2 we discover that Cornwall and Regan, getting the heads up that the king was coming to visit them, decide to be out of town. They leave their house and go over to Gloucester's, so that the king won't find them at home. Edmund, meanwhile, is continuing his plot against his brother and his father, stirring up the tension between them. And he fakes a fight with Edgar, acting like Edgar was trying to kill him. And so Gloucester sends out a whole bunch of people and tries to hunt Edgar down. Kent and Oswald run into each other, and Kent realizes that Oswald has gone ahead and messed things up for Lear even more, and he's so angry that he fights with Oswald. Cornwall and Regan break them up, and then they lock Kent in the stocks, even though he's a servant sent from the king, her father. After they leave, Kent reveals that he has a letter from Cordelia, saying that she's heard about all the bad stuff going down between Regan, Goneril, and Lear, and that she's coming with a French force to try to straighten things out and to help her father. Meanwhile, Edgar, who has had to run away from his dad, not knowing what he's even done wrong, has gone into disguise, and he's dressed up as a madman, Tom of Bedlam. King Lear and his dwindling entourage arrive at Regan's house, and they find Kent in the stocks. We find that as Lear's influence begins to wane, he also is losing his followers. And so even though his daughters are trying to trim off his buddies, they're really beginning to trim themselves off. Lear rages against the imprisoning of his servant, Kent, and he also tells Regan about how awful her sister Goneril is. At this point, Goneril shows up, and she goes over and puts her arms around Regan, and the two of them are standing together smiling against Lear. Lear's horrified that his daughters are in cahoots, and both of them against him, when they said that they loved him! When he begs Regan to take him and his 100 knights in, she says, no, I'll take 25 of your knights. King Lear is so horrified by this that he turns back to Goneril, even though he cursed her up and down only 5 minutes ago, and says, well, you would allow me 50, so I'll go back to your house. And she says, if you come back, you can't have any knights with you. You're coming back all alone. Lear is so horrified by all this that finally, after he's been chided by both of his daughters, broken-hearted, he runs out into a gathering storm. Regan and Cornwall lock the door behind him, even though this isn't their house. Remember they're at Gloucester's house? Gloucester's upset by this, but basically they suppress him and say, nah, we're gonna lock him out in the storm. Let him deal with his own bad attitude. Act 3. Kent is wandering around in the storm trying to find Lear, who wandered out alone. And he runs into a gentleman who he trusts, and he tells him that Cordelia is coming, and to send a message to her. Meanwhile, Lear is basically shouting at the lightning and thunder. This is a great section, and one, every time it rains or storms, I love running outside and shouting this at the storm too. Blow, wind, and crack your cheeks! Rage, blow! The only person still with Lear is his fool, who is terrified by the storm, but Kent finds him and tries to direct him into a little hovel nearby. Meanwhile, back at Gloucester's house, he is so upset by the treatment of Lear that he's going to go out and find Lear and help him. And he confides this to Edmund. Edmund, of course, is happy to snitch to Cornwall and Regan, and when he also finds out that Gloucester knows of Cordelia's coming, he decides to snitch this too, handing his dad over as a traitor so he can take his dad's land. Lear, Kent, and the Fool find the little hovel and crawl inside, but inside they find is crazy Tom of Bedlam, who's actually Edgar in disguise. Gloucester finds them and tells them that he'll take them all in. And Lear, who is now broken, he has lost his mind because of his grief over the ingratitude of his daughters, now believes that Edgar is a great advisor and philosopher, even though he's just muttering crazy stuff. And so they take the disguised Edgar with them. Edmund, meanwhile, is climbing the ladder by giving evidence against his father over to Cornwall. Gloucester leads Lear and the little band of followers into an outbuilding where he hides them for now. And Lear, who has lost his wits, then has a trial scene where he puts his daughters on trial in his imagination. And he has the Fool and Edgar sit there as judges. It's a great scene and well worth looking at closely. Then Gloucester rushes in and says they're after him and they want to kill the king. He needs to head off to Dover. Just after this, Cornwall, Regan, and Goneril capture Gloucester and show him the evidence that his son has presented against him. Cornwall then demands what has become of the king, and when Gloucester finally admits that he sent him away to Dover to get them out of their clutches, Cornwall gouges out Gloucester's eyes. It's a pretty horrifying scene. The servants, in fact, are so horrified that one of them stands up to Cornwall and says, I can't take this anymore. I've served you all my life, but you're not going to do this. This is too bad. The two of them fight, and he injures Cornwall, but is stabbed in the back by Regan. They then throw the blinded Gloucester out, as Regan says, to smell his way to Dover. Cornwall reveals that he's been mortally wounded by the servant, and he's bleeding out, while a couple of other servants decide that they're going to do what little help they can for Gloucester. Act 4 returns us to Edgar, who's still acting the part of a crazy man. There he finds his blinded father, who's being led by an old man. Not recognizing his son, he asks Edgar to lead him to the cliffs of Dover, where he plans to throw himself off. Edgar decides to do what he can to help his father, and so he leads him on. Meanwhile, Goneril's making really big cow eyes at Edmund, trying to woo him, even though she's already married to Albany. She's sick of her stupid, puny, weak husband, who's nice and stuff. She wants a real man, like this Edmund, who's now taking all the power of Gloucester. And when Albany does come up and start talking to her, he's horrified at the treatment of Gloucester, and he's horrified at the treatment of the king. Not only that, but now we're about to go to war, because France is coming up to straighten things out here. So Albany and Cornwall have to gather their arms. But oh look, Cornwall's now dead. Kent hears how Cordelia has taken all of the news about her father and how heartbroken she is, how much she still loves him, even though he treated her like a jerk. And we see her not only preparing her army, but also trying to get a doctor to find the missing and wandering crazy Lear and bring him home and cure him of his madness. Regan, meanwhile, is thinking about now that her husband is dead, she can get with Edmund. So we've got both sisters after him now. And she tries to win over the corrupt jerk servant Oswald to her case. Edgar's still leading Gloucester, and he tricks him into thinking that he's on the top of the highest cliff in Dover, and Gloucester tries to commit suicide by jumping off the cliff, but really he's just standing on basically flat ground. And so when he flumps over on the ground, he thinks he's fallen. And Edgar rushes up pretending to be someone else and saying that he floated down really gently. How did you fall so far and not get hurt? And gives him the impression that some supernatural force protected him to keep him from doing such a wicked thing as committing suicide. And Gloucester repents of his desire for suicide. Just at that moment, in comes crazy King Lear, who's dancing around with all these weeds in his hair. And Lear shows himself a broken man, completely lost in his mind because of the ingratitude of his daughters. And he's saying things to Gloucester who he sort of doesn't seem to recognize for a few moments, about how illegitimate sons like Edmund are better than legitimate children like Goneril and Regan. A gentleman arrives with some servants to try to take Lear away and cure him at Cordelia's wishes, and he runs away and they have to chase him. At this point, Oswald comes in, and finding Gloucester decides that he'll probably win a little bit more respect from his mistress if he kills Gloucester and this other guy protecting him. But Edgar jumps in the way and rescues his father, killing Oswald. As Oswald dies, he reveals that he has important letters for Edmund. If Edgar will take them to him, he'll probably be rewarded. Edgar, of course, has no desire to take these to his brother Edmund, but he opens them and finds all kinds of treason. Goneril wants to kill her husband in order to be with Edmund. And so Edgar sees in this an opportunity to set things right. And so he takes Gloucester and they head towards the camp. Meanwhile, Cordelia is with her father, and the doctor has administered as much cure as he can. Lear wakes up, and in a moment of befuddlement, he recognizes his daughter. And there is an incredibly touching scene of reunion, as he recognizes how very mistaken he was, and yet here's his daughter treating him with so much love and respect. But we have a battle to fight, because the forces of England are up against Cordelia's French forces. Act 5. Edgar sneaks into the English camp, and without revealing himself, speaks to Albany, saying that he has a letter that he needs to read, and also that he would like to challenge Edmund and fight him as a traitor. So after this battle is over, sound the trumpet, and a champion will stand forth to fight Edmund. Also, Regan and Goneril have both sort of realized that they're both competing for Edmund, and so they both are staring daggers at each other and acting really vindictive against each other. Meanwhile, Edgar tries to keep Gloucester out of the worst of the fighting, but then, when the English forces beat the French and Cordelia is taken, Edgar and Gloucester run. Edmund, who seems like he's really won the day, has Lear and Cordelia captive, and he has them dragged off to prison. One of the best moments in the play is the speeches between Cordelia and Lear, as they are without anything, without help, without forces, without land, in the hands of their enemies. Yet because they love each other and because they've been reunited, they're happy as long as they're together. It's a beautiful moment. But Edmund's not going to let it last, because he nudges one of his cronies and says, "Go kill them, please." Albany comes forth, though, and issues the challenge against Edmund, showing that Edmund is actually a traitor. And when he sounds the trumpet, up comes this disguised man who is nameless and penniless and propertyless, yet because of the love for his father is going to challenge Edmund, who now owns everything. At the same time, Regan and Goneril are arguing over who should get Edmund, but all of a sudden Regan starts getting really sick because she's been poisoned by her sister. But as the whole plot that Regan had to kill her husband is revealed, Regan runs away and kills herself after confessing that she poisoned her sister. Edmund fights with Edgar and is defeated and is dying. And as he's dying, he has a bit of a change of heart and he goes ahead and confesses everything. Especially when he discovers that it's his own brother who's killed him. He confesses all of his plots, including, at the end, the one to hang Cordelia. Quickly, Albany sends to rescue her, but it's too late. in comes King Lear holding the body of his beloved daughter Cordelia. The play concludes as Lear, a broken man, tries to find breath on her lips, hoping that she's still alive. And in the heartbreak of his grief, he dies, leaving Albany and Edgar to sort out the pieces. There's so much to unpack in this play. It's well worth examining that final conversation between Lear and Cordelia, where we see that happiness and love can exist even if you're imprisoned and penniless and helpless. But measuring love by pride and power and property only bring heartbreak and grief. Thanks for watching! I'm going to do a further examination of each of the acts of this play after I finish going through all of Shakespeare plays this year. And once those are done, you can click on those here. Or you can click to look at some of my other Shakespeare discussions. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.